Figured I'd go living in for a bit. I always want to stream more, whether I can is another matter. Time, it's always about time, but oh well. I did care admirably enough all the way into chapter 11 earlier today. So honestly, not all that much left. I mean, a decent bit left, but chapter 11 is further than I thought I'd got to on that earlier stream. Didn't feel that amazingly well. Although, to be fair, still don't, a bit lightheaded still, but oh well. Got a little bit more sleep, small nap in between, so there's that. And well, I am hyped, or at least quite looking forward to reading more of this book, so we'll be doing more of that. And let me just see, I think just could normally start 5 minutes in, right? Just ramble on for a little bit again first. Hey, miss, how do you do? Hope you're doing well still. Surprised you're still awake. But I'm guessing you're off to bed soon. Yeah, sorry I had to, sorry I had to end earlier. And I just muted and loud stuff keeps on driving by, but yeah, I don't know, just sorry about that earlier. Glad you can catch the stream now. Busy with work. Hope it's not too bad. Oh, that's alright. That's alright. No worries. I didn't sleep that well, so I ended up, oh no, earlier wasn't about the noises, just mainly about me not having slept too well. I ended up cutting it short at about 3 hours. Although, to be fair, 3 hours is a decent bit as well. And then I've got a hard limit on this stream for about 2, so just short streams, but throughout the day. That's pretty alright as well. Gives me some time to take a proper break in between. It's honestly not the worst schedule. But alright. Let me jump back into that book. Guessing you missed more of it, or you missed all of it then, right? I might have to give a bit of a recap. Just looking back real quick. So chapter 12 does kind of jump into something that's quite related to what was going on in chapter 11, I think. Although it was a nice cliffhanger, it's not the greatest to resume back on. Well, let's just say the Invisible Man was just in a bit of a argument with two other people, basically. Kind of for context. Oh, sorry to hear that, miss. Sorry to hear that. Hope it gets better. But yeah, sometimes management doesn't quite see what's quite the right thing to do. But well, let me jump in that in chapter 12. The Invisible Man loses his temper. It is unavoidable that at this point the narrative should break off again, for a certain very painful reason that will presently be apparent. All these things were going on in the parlour, and while Mr. Huckster was watching Mr. Hall and Teddy Humphrey discussing in a state of cloudy puzzlement the one hyping topic, suddenly there came a violent thud against the door of the parlour, a sharp cry, and then that silence. Enjoy your alertness, and it is a very, very fascinating and interesting book. Been very fun so far. Hello, said Teddy Humphrey. Hello, from the tap. Mr. Hall took things in slowly but surely. That ain't right, he said, and came round from behind the bar towards the parlour door. He and Teddy approached the door together with intense faces, their eyes considered. Something's wrong, said Hall, and Humphrey nodded agreement. Whiffs of an unpleasant chemical odour met them, and there was a muffled sound of conversation, very rapid and subdued. And hello there, Mary. Hope you're well. Good day, good day. And hello again, Robinson. Hope you're well as well. I'm good, I'm good. You're right there, asked Hall, rapping. The mother conversation ceased abruptly. For a moment, silence, then the conversation was resumed, in hissing whispers and a sharp cry of no, no you don't. There came a sudden motion and the oversetting of a chair, a brief struggle, silence again. What the deuce, exclaimed Humphrey sotto voce. You all right there? Asked Mr. Hall sharply again. The vicar's voice answered with a curious jerking intonation. Quite right, please don't interrupt. Odd, said Mr. Humphrey. Odd, said Mr. Hall. Sis, don't interrupt, said Humphrey. I heard, said Hall. And a sniff, said Humphrey. They remained listening. The conversation was rapid and subdued. said Mr. Bunting, his voice rising. I tell you, sir, I will not. What was that? Asked Henry. Says he winnered, said Hall. Wasn't speaking to us, was he? Disgraceful, said Mr. Bunting within. Disgraceful, said Mr. Henry. I heard it distinct. Who's that speaking now? Asked Henry. Mr. Gus, I suppose, said Hall. Can you hear anything? Silence, the sounds within indistinct and perplexing. Sounds like throwing the tablecloth about, said Hall. Mrs. Hall appeared behind the bar. Hall made gestures of silence and invitation. This aroused Mrs. Hall's wave of position. What you're listening for there, Hall? She asked. Ain't you nothing better to do, busy day like this? Hall tried to convey everything by grimaces and dumb show, but Mrs. Hall was obdurate. She raised her voice so Hall and Henry, rather crestfallen, tiptoed back to the bar, gesticulating to explain to her. At first she refused to see anything in what they had heard at all. Then she insisted on all keeping silence, while Henry told her the story. She was inclined to think her whole business nonsense. Perhaps they were just moving the furniture about. I heardn't say disgraceful that I did, said Hall. I heard that, Miss Hall, said Henry. Like as not, began Miss Hall. Hush, said Teddy Henry. Didn't I hear the window? What window? Asked Mrs. Hall. Parlour window, said Henry. Everyone stood listening intently. Mrs. Hall's eyes, directed straight before her, saw without seeing the brilliant oblong of the inn door, the road wide and vivid, and Huckster's shop front blistering in the June sun. Abruptly, Huckster's door opened, and Huckster appeared, eyes staring with excitement, arms gesticulating. Yup, cried Huckster, stop, thief, and he ran obliquely across the oblong towards the yard gates, and vanished. Simultaneous came a tumult from the parlour and the sound of windows being closed. Hall, Henry, and the human contents of the tap rushed out at once, pell-mell into the street. They saw someone whisk round the corner towards the road, and Mr. Huckster executing a complicated leap in the air that ended on his face and shoulder. Down the street people were standing astonished or running towards them. Mr. Huckster was stunned. Henry stopped to discover this, but Hall and the two labourers from the tap rushed at once to the corner, shouting incoherent things, and saw Mr. Marvel vanishing by the corner of the church wall. They appeared to have jumped to the impossible conclusion that this was the invisible man suddenly become visible, and set off at once along the lane in pursuit. But Hall had hardly run a dozen yards before he gave a loud shout of astonishment and went flying headlong sideways, clutching one of the labourers and bringing him to the ground. He had been charged just as one charges a man at football, The second labourer came round in a circle, stared and conceiving that all had tumbled over of his own accord, turned to resume the pursuit, only to be tripped by the ankle, just as Huckster had been. Then, as the first labourer struggled to his feet, he was kicked sideways by a blow that might have felled an ox. As he went down, the rush from the direction of the village green came around the corner. The first to appear was the proprietor of the Coconut Shy, a burly man in a blue jersey. He was astonished to see the lane empty save for 3 men sprawling absurdly on the ground. And then something happened to his rearmost foot, and he went headlong and rode sideways, just in time to graze the feet of his brother and partner, following headlong. The two were then kicked and knelt on, fallen over, and cursed by quite a number of overhasty people. Now when all went envy, and the labourers ran out of the house, Mrs. Hall, who had been disciplined by years of experience, remained in the bar next to Till. And suddenly the parlour door was opened, and Mr. Cuss appeared, and without glancing at her rushed at once down the steps toward the corner. "Hold him," he cried, "don't let him drop that parcel." He knew nothing of the existence of Marvel, for the invisible man had handed over the books and bundle in the yard. The face of Mr. Cuss was angry and resolute, but his costume was defective, a sort of limp white kilt that could only have passed muster and grease. "Hold him," he bawled. "He's got my trousers and every stitch of the vicar's clothes." "Tend to him in a minute," he cried to Henry as he passed the prostrate Huckster, and coming around the corner to join the tumult, was promptly knocked off his feet into an indecorous sprawl. Somebody in full flight trod heavily on his finger. He yelled, struggled to regain his feet, was knocked against and thrown on all fours again, and became aware that he was in full running capture, but a rout. Everyone was running back to the village. He arose again and was hit severely behind the ear. He staggered and set off, back to the coach and horses forthwith, leaping over the deserted Huckster, who was now sitting up on his way. Behind him, as he was all halfway up the inn steps, he heard a sudden yell of rage, rising sharply out of the confusion of cries, and a sounding smack in someone's face. He recognized the voice as that of the invisible man, and the note was that of a man suddenly infuriated by a painful blow. In another moment Mr. Cuss was back in the parlour. "He's coming back, Bunting," he said, rushing in. "Save yourself." Mr. Bunting was standing in the window, engaged in an attempt to clothe himself in the hard rock and the West-Surrey Gazette. "Who's coming?" he said, so startled that his costume narrowly escaped disintegration. "Invisible man," said Cuss, and rushed on to the window. "We'd better clear out from here. He's fighting mad. In another moment he was out in the yard. "Good heavens," said Mr. Bunting, hesitating between two horrible alternatives. He heard a frightful struggle in the passage at the inn, and his decision was made. He clambered out of the window, adjusting his costume hastily, and fled up the village as fast as his fat little legs would carry him. from the moment when the Invisible Man screamed with rage and Mr. Bunting made his memorable flyer of the village, it became impossible to give a consecutive account of affairs in Iping. Possibly the Invisible Man's original intention was simply to cover Marvel's retreat with the clothes and books, but his temper at no time very good seems to have gone completely at some chance blow, and forthwith he set to smiting and overthrowing for the mere satisfaction of hurting. Hello, Pixel Vegas, not at all, not at all. The stream will probably be about 2 hours, so not too late at all. Hope you're doing well, and good day, good day. You must figure the street full of running figures, of doors slamming and fights for hiding places. You must figure the tumult suddenly striking on the unstable equilibrium of old Fletcher's planks and 2 chairs, with cataclysmic results. You must figure an appalled couple caught dismally in a swing, and then the whole tumultuous rush has passed and the Iping street, with its gauds and flags, is deserted, save for the still raging unseen, and littered with coconuts, overthrown canvas screens, and the scattered stock and trade of a sweet-stuffed stall. Everywhere there is a sound of closing shutters and shoving bolts, and the only visible humanity is an occasional flitting eye under a raised eyebrow in the corner of a window pane. The Invisible Man amused himself for a little while by breaking all the windows in the coach and horses, and then he thrust a street lamp through the parlour window of Mrs. Gribble. He it must have been who cut a telegraph wire to Aberdeen just beyond Haines's cottage, on the Aberdeen road, and after that, as his peculiar qualities allowed, he passed out of human perceptions altogether, and he was neither heard, seen, nor felt in Iping any more. He vanished absolutely, but was the best part of 2 hours before any human being ventured out again into the desolation of Iping Street. Alright, and chapter 13, Mr. Marvel discusses his resignation. When the dusk was gathering and Iping was just beginning to peep timorously forth again upon the sheltered wreckage of its bank holiday, a short, thick-set man in a shabby silk hat was marching painfully through the twilight behind the beechwoods on the road to Bramblers. He carried 3 books bound together by some sort of ornamental, elastic ligature, and a bundle wrapped in a blue tablecloth. His rubicund face expressed consternation and fatigue. He appeared to be in a spasmodic sort of hurry. He was accompanied by a voice other than his own, and ever and again he winced under the touch of unseen hands. "If you give me the slip again," said the voice, "if you attempt to give me the slip again—" "Lord," said Mr. Marvel, "that shoulder's a mass of bruises." "On my honor," said the voice, "I will kill you." "I didn't try to give you the slip," said Marvel, in a voice that was not far removed from tears. "I swear I didn't. I didn't know the blessed turning, that was all. How the devil was I to know the blessed turning? As it is, I've been knocked about. You'll get knocked about a great deal more if you don't mind, said the voice, and Mr. Marvel abruptly became silent. He blew out his cheeks, and his eyes were eloquent of despair. "'Tis bad enough to let these floundering yokels explode my little secret without your cutting off with my books. It's lucky for some of them they cut on their end when they did. Here am I, no one knew I was invisible, and now what am I to do?" "What am I to do?" asked Marvel sotto voce. "It's all about, it will be in the papers. Everybody will be looking for me, everyone on their guard." The voice broke off into vivid curses and ceased. The despair of Mr. Marvel's face deepened, and his pace slackened. "Go on," said the voice. Mr. Marvel's face assumed a greyish tint between the ruddier patches. "Don't drop those books, stupid," said the voice sharply, overtaking him. "The fact is," said the voice, "I shall have made use of you. You're a poor tool, but I must." "I'm a miserable tool," said Marvel. "You are," said the voice. "I'm the worst possible tool you could have," said Marvel. "I'm not strong," he said after a discouraging silence. "I'm not over-strong," he repeated. "No. At my heart's weak, that little business. I pulled it through, of course, but bless you, I could have dropped. Well, I haven't the nerve and strength for the sort of thing you want. I'll stimulate you. I'll wish I wouldn't. I wouldn't like to mess up your plans, you know, but I might, out of sheer funk and misery." "You'd better not," said the voice with quiet emphasis. "I wish I was that," said Marvel. "It ain't justice, right? It ain't justice," he said. "You must admit, it seems to me I've a perfect right." "Get on," said the voice. Mr. Marvel mended his pace, and for a time they went in silence again. "It's devilish hard," said Mr. Marvel. This was quite ineffectual. He tried another tack. "What do I make by it?" he began again in a tone of unendurable wrong. "Oh, shut up," said the voice with sudden amazing vigour. "I'll see to you all right. You do what you're told. You'll do it all right. You're a fool and all that, but you'll do. I tell you, sir, I'm not the man for it. Respectfully, but it is so. If you don't shut up, I shall twist your wrist again," said the invisible man. "I want to think." Presently 2 oblongs of yellow light appeared through the trees, and the square tower of a church loomed through the gloaming. "I shall keep my hand on your shoulder," said the voice, "all through the village. Go straight through and try no foolery. It will be the worse for you if you do." "I know that," sighed Mr. Marvel. "I know all that." The unhappy-looking figure in the obsolete silk hat passed up the street of the little village with his burdens, and vanished into the gathering darkness beyond the lights at the windows. Alright, quick breather between chapters. Chapter 14. 10 o'clock the next morning found Mr. Marvel unshaven, dirty and travel-stained, sitting with the books beside him, and his hands deep in his pockets, looking very weary, nervous and uncomfortable, and inflating his cheeks at infrequent intervals. On the bench outside a little inn on the outskirts of Portstow. "Hello again, Junior. Yes, indeed. Had a small nap a bit at dinner, and now I'm back. For an hour or two, that is." Beside him were the books, but now they were tied with string. The bundle had been abandoned in the pine woods beyond Bramblehurst, in accordance with a change in the plans of the Invisible Man. Mr. Marvel sat on the bench, and although no one took the slightest notice of him, his agitation remained at fever heat. His hands would go ever and again to his various pockets with a curious nervous fumbling. When he had been sitting for the best part of an hour, however, an elderly mariner carrying a newspaper came out of the inn and sat down beside him. "Pleasant day," said the mariner. Good luck with the dishes, Junior. Take care." Mr. Marvel glanced about him with something very like terror. "Very," he said. "Just seasonable weather for the time of year," said the mariner, taking no denial. "Quite," said Mr. Marvel. The mariner produced a toothpick and, saving his regard, was engrossed thereby for some minutes. His eyes meanwhile were at liberty to examine Mr. Marvel's dusty figure and the books beside him. As he had approached Mr. Marvel, he had heard a sound like the dropping of coins into a pocket. He was struck by the contrast of Mr. Marvel's appearance with the suggestion of opulence. Thence his mind wandered back again to a topic that had taken a curiously firm hold of his imagination. "Books," he said suddenly, noisily finishing with a toothpick. Mr. Marvel started and looked at him. "Oh yes," he said. "Yes, they're books. There's some extraordinary things in books," said the mariner. "Oh, I believe ya," said Mr. Marvel. "And some extraordinary things out of 'em," said the mariner. "True, likewise," said Mr. Marvel. He eyed his interlocutor and then glanced about him. "There's some extraordinary things in newspapers, for example," said the mariner. "There are, indeed." "In this newspaper," said the mariner. "Ah," said Mr. Marvel. "There's a story," said the mariner, fixing Mr. Marvel with an eye that was firm and deliberate. "There's a story about an invisible man, for instance." Mr. Marvel put his mouth askew and scratched his cheek and felt his ears glowing. "What will they be writing next?" he asked faintly. "Austria or America?" "Neither," said the mariner. "Here." "Lord," said Mr. Marvel, starting. "When I say here," said the mariner, to Mr. Marvel's intense relief, "I don't of course mean here in this place. I mean hereabouts." "That invisible man," said Mr. Marvel. "And what's he been up to?" "Everything," said the mariner, controlling Marvel with his eye, and amplifying every blessed thing. "I ain't seen a paper these 4 days," said Marvel. "Iping's that place he started at," said the mariner. "Indeed," said Mr. Marvel. "He started there where he came from. Nobody don't seem to know. Here it is, peculiar story from Iping, and it says in his newspaper that the evidence is extraordinary strong, extraordinary." "Lord," exclaimed Mr. Marvel, "but then it's an extraordinary story. There is a clergyman, the medical, gent witnesses saw him all right and proper, or leastways didn't see him. He was staying, it says, at the Coach and Horses, and no one don't seem to have been aware of his misfortune. It says aware of his misfortune until on another occasion in the inn. It says his bandages on his hat was torn off. It was then observed that his hat was invisible. Attempts were at once made to secure him, but casting off his garments, it says, he succeeded in escaping. But not until after a desperate struggle in which he had inflicted serious injuries. It says on our worthy and able constable, Mr. J.A. Jevers. Pretty straight story, eh? Names and everything." "Lord," said Mr. Marvel, looking nervously about him, trying to count the money in his pockets by his unaided sense of touch, and full of a strange and novel idea. "It sounds most astonishing. Don't it? Extraordinary, I call it. Never heard tell of invisible men before, I haven't. But nowadays one hears such a lot of extraordinary things. That all he did," asked Marvel, trying to seem at his ease. "It's enough, ain't it?" said the mariner. And the low flicks through. Pure well. I'll come back again. "So he didn't go back by any chance?" asked Marvel. "Just escaped, and that's all, eh?" "Oh," said the mariner. "Why, ain't it enough?" "Oh, quite enough," said Marvel. "I shouldn't think it was enough," said the mariner. "I should think it was enough." "You didn't have any pause, it don't say you had any pause, does it?" asked Mr. Marvel, anxious. "Ain't one of the sort enough for ya?" asked the mariner. "No, thank heaven," as one might say, he didn't. He nodded his head slowly. "It makes me regular uncomfortable with the bare thought of that chap running about the country." "Oh, wait. That is the mariner again, sorry. "It makes me regular uncomfortable with the bare thought of that chap running about the country. He is at present at large, and from certain evidence, they suppose that he has took, I suppose, I mean, the road to Portstow. You see you are right in it, none of your American wonder this time. And just think of the things he might do. Where'd you be if he took and drop over in the buff, and had a fancy to go for you? Suppose he wants to rob, who can prevent him? He can trespass, he can borrow, he could walk through a cordon of policemen as easy as me or you could give the slip to a blind man. Easier for these here blind chaps here uncommon sharp, I'm told, and wherever there was liquor he fancied. He's got tremendous advantage, certainly, said Mr. Marvel. And well, you're right, said the mariner, yes. All this time Mr. Marvel had been glancing about him intently, listening for faint footfalls, trying to detect imperceptible movements. He seemed on the point of some great resolution. He coughed behind his hand. He looked about him again, listened, bent towards the mariner and lowered his voice. The fact of it is, I happen to know just a thing or two about this invisible man, from private sources. Oh, said the mariner, interested. You? Yes, said Mr. Marvel. Me. Indeed, said the mariner, and may I ask? Oh, you'll be astonished, said Mr. Marvel behind his hand. It's tremendous. Indeed, said the mariner. The fact is, began Mr. Marvel eagerly, in a confidential undertone. Suddenly his expression changed marvellously. Oh, he said. He rose stiffly in his seat, his face was eloquent of physical suffering. Wow, he said. What's up? Said the mariner, concerned. Toothache, said Mr. Marvel, and put his hand to his ear. He caught hold of his books. I must be getting on, I think, he said. He edged in a curious way along the seat, away from his interlocutor. But he was just going to tell me about this here invisible man, protested the mariner. Mr. Marvel seemed to console with himself. Hoax, said a voice. "'Tis a hoax. "'Tis a hoax, said Mr. Marvel. But it's in the paper, said Mariner. Hoax all the same, said Marvel. I know the chap that started the lie. There ain't no invisible man whatsoever, blimey. 'Tis all fake news, young'un. But how about this paper, do you mean to say? Not a word of it, said Marvel stoutly. The mariner stared, paper in hand. Mr. Marvel jerkily faced about. Wait a bit, said the mariner, rising and speaking slowly. Do you mean to say? I do, said Mr. Marvel. Then why did you let me go on and tell you all this blasted stuff then? What do you mean by letting a man make a fool of himself like that for, eh? Mr. Marvel blew out his cheeks. The mariner was suddenly very red indeed. He clenched his hands. I've been talking here this 10 minutes, he said, and you little pot-bellied leathery-faced son of an old boot, couldn't have the elementary manners. Don't ye come bandying words with me, said Mr. Marvel. Bandying words, I'm in a jolly good mind. Come up, said a voice, and Mr. Marvel was suddenly whirled about, and started marching off in a curious, spasmodic manner. You'd better move on, said the mariner. Who's moving on? Said Mr. Marvel. He was receding obliquely, with a curious hurrying gait, with occasional violent jerks forward. Some way along the road, he began a muttered monologue, protests and recriminations. Silly devil, said the mariner, legs wide apart, elbows akimbo, watching the receding figure. I'll show you, you silly ass, hoaxing me. It's here on the paper. Mr. Marvel retorted, and incoherently, and receding, was hidden by a bend in the road, but the mariner still stood magnificent in the midst of the way, until the approach of a butcher's cart dislodged him. Then he turned himself to watchboard stow. "Full extraordinary asses," he said softly to himself. Just to take me down a bit. That was a silly game. It's on the paper." And there was another extraordinary thing he was presently to hear that happened quite close to him, and that was a vision of a fistful of money, no less, travelling without visible agency, along by the wall at the corner of St. Michael's Lane. The brother mariner had seen this wonderful sight that very morning. He had snatched at the money forthwith, and had been knocked headlong, and when he had got to his feet the butterfly money had vanished. Our mariner was in the mood to believe anything, he declared, but that was a bit too stiff. Afterwards, however, he began to think things over. The story of the flying money was true, and all about the neighbourhood, even from the August London and Country Banking Company, from the tales of shops and inns, doors standing that sunny weather entirely open. Money had been quietly and dexterously making off that day, in handfuls under low, floating quietly along by walls and shady places, dodging quickly from the approaching eyes of men. And that, though no man had traced it, invariably ended its mysterious flight in the pocket of that agitated gentleman in the obsolete silk hat, sitting outside the little inn on the outskirts of Portstow. 'Twas 10 days after, and indeed only when the Burdock story was already told, that the mariner collated these facts and began to understand how near he had been to the wonderful invisible man. Alright, small breather between chapters again. Actually, let me drink a bit as well. Chapter 15. The Man Who Was Running. In the early evening time, Dr. Kemp was sitting in his study in the Belvedere on the hill overlooking Burdock. It was a pleasant little room with 3 windows, north, west and south, and bookshelves covered with books and scientific publications, and a broad writing table, and under the north window a microscope, glass slips, minute instruments, some cultures, and scattered bottles of reagents. Dr. Kemp's solar lamp was lit, albeit the sky was still bright with the sunset light, and his blinds were up because there was no offence of peering outsiders to require them pulled down. Dr. Kemp was a tall and slender young man with flaxen hair and a moustache almost white, and the work he was upon would earn him, he hoped, the fellowship of the Royal Society, so highly did he think of it. And his eye, presently wandering from his work, got the sunset blazing at the back of the hill that is over against his own, For a minute perhaps he sat, pen in mouth, admiring the rich golden colour of the crest, and then his attention was attracted by the little figure of a man, inky black, running over the hill brow towards him. He was a shortish little man, and he wore a high hat, and he was running so fast that his legs fairly twinkled. "Another of those fools," said Dr. Kemp, "like that ass who ran into me this morning round the corner. What a visible man a-coming, sir. I can't imagine what possesses people. One might think we were in the 13th century. "Hello, Bloodcat's Cloud. How do you do? Hope you're well." He got up and went to the window and stared at the dusky hillside and the dark little figure tearing down it. "He seems in a confounded hurry," said Dr. Kemp, "but he doesn't seem to be getting on. If his pockets were full of lead, he couldn't run heavier." "Spurred, sir," said Dr. Kemp. In another moment the higher of the villas that had clambered up the hill from Burdock had occulted the running figure. He was visible again for a moment, and again, 3 times between the 3 detached houses that came next, and then the terrace hit him. "Asses," said Dr. Kemp, swinging round on his heel and walking back to his writing table. But those who saw the fugitive nearer and perceived the abject terror on his perspiring face, being themselves in the open roadway, did not share in the doctor's contempt. By the man pounded, and as he ran he chinked like a well-filled purse that is tossed to and fro. He looked neither to the right nor the left, but his dilated eyes stared straight downhill to where the lamps were being lit and the people were crowded in the street, and his ill-shaped mouth fell apart, and a glary foam lay on his lips, and his breath came hoarse and nosy. All he passed stopped and began staring up the road and down, and interrogating one another with an inkling of discomfort for the reason of his haste. And then presently, far up the hill, a dog playing in the road yelped and ran under a gate. And as they still wondered something, a wind, a pad, 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 a sound like a panting breathing rushed by. People screamed, people sprang over the pavement. It passed in shouts, it passed by instinct down the hill. They were shouting in the street before Marvel was halfway there. They were bolting into houses and slamming the doors behind them. With the news, he heard it and made one last desperate spurt. Fear came striding by, rushed ahead of him, and in a moment had seized the town. The invisible man is coming, the invisible man. Alright, quick breather between chapters. Chapter 16. In the Jolly Cricketers. The Jolly Cricketers is just at the bottom of the hill, where the trim lines begin. The barman leaned his fat red arms on the counter and talked of horses with an anemic cabman, while a black-bearded man in grey snapped up biscuit and cheese. Drank Burton and covered in American with a policeman off duty, and conversed in American. Of course, people in England conversing in American. Such a world of difference. What's the shouting about? Said the anemic cabman, going off for a tangent, trying to see up the hill, over the dirty yellow blind in a low window of the inn. Somebody ran by outside. Fire, perhaps, said the barman. Footsteps approached, running heavily. The door was pushed open violently, and Mr. Marvel, weeping and dishevelled, his head gone, the neck of his coat torn open, rushed in, made a convulsive turn, and attempted to shut the door. It was held half open by a strap. "Coming," he bawled, his voice shrieking with terror. "He's coming, the invisible man after me. For God's sake, help, help, help." "Shut the door," said the policeman. "Who's coming? What's the row?" He went to the door, released the strap, and it slammed. The American closed the door. "Let me go inside," said Marvel, staggering and weeping, but still clutching the books. "Let me go inside, lock me in somewhere. I tell ya he's after me. I give him the slip, he said he'd kill me, and he will." "You're safe," said a man with a black beard. "The door's shut, what's it all about?" "Let me go inside," said Marvel, and shrieked aloud as a blow suddenly made the fastened door shiver. It was followed by a hurried rapping and a shouting outside. "Hello," cried a policeman. "Who's there?" Mr. Marvel began to make frantic dives at panels that looked like doors. "He'll kill me, he's got a knife or something, for God's sake." "Here you are," said the barman. "Come in here." And he held up the flap of the bar. Mr. Marvel rushed behind the bars. The summons outside was repeated. "Don't open the door," she screamed. "Please don't open the door." "Where shall I hide?" This invisible man, then?" asked the man with a black beard, with one hand behind him. "I guess it's about time we saw him." The window of the inn was suddenly smashed in, and there was a screaming and a running to and fro in the street. The policeman had been standing on a settee, staring out, craning to see who was at the door. He got down with raised eyebrows. "It's that," he said. The barman stood in front of the bar parlour door, which was now locked on Mr. Marvel, stared at the smashed window, and came round to the two other men. Everything was suddenly quiet. "I wish I had my truncheon," said the policeman, going irresolutely to the door. "Once we open, and he comes, there's no stopping him." "Don't you be in too much hurry about that door," said the anemic cabman anxiously. "Draw the bolt," said the man with a black beard, "and if he comes," he showed a revolver in his hand. "That won't do," said the policeman. "That's murder." "I know what country I'm in," said the man with the beard. "I'm going to let off at his legs. Draw the bolts." "Not with that blinking thing going off behind me," said the barman, craning over the blind. "Very well," said the man with the black beard, and stooping down, revolver ready, drew them himself. Barman, cabman, and policeman faced about. "Come in," said the bearded man in an undertone, standing back and facing the unbolted doors with his pistol behind him. No one came in. The door remained closed. 5 minutes afterwards, when a second cabman pushed his head in cautiously, they were still waiting, and an anxious face peered out of the bar parlour and supplied information. Are all the doors of the house shut? Asked Marvel. He's going around, prowling around. He's as artful as the devil. Good Lord, said the burly barman. There's the back, just watch them doors, I say. He looked about him helplessly. The bar parlour door slammed, and they heard the key turn. There's the yard door and the private door and... Oh, the yard door. He rushed out of the bar. In a minute he reappeared with a carving knife in his hand. The yard door was open, he said, and his fat under lip dropped. He may be in the house now, said the first cabman. Well, he's not in the kitchen, said the barman. There's 2 women there, and I've stabbed every inch of it with his little beef slicer, and they don't think he's come in. They haven't noticed. Have you fastened it? Asked the first cabman. I'm out of frocks, said the barman. The man with the beard replaced his revolver, and even as he did so, the flap of the bar was shut down, and the bolt clicked, and then, with a tremendous thud, the catch of the door snapped, and the bar parlour door burst open. They heard Marvel squeal like a caught leveret, and forthwith they were clambering over the bar to his rescue. The bearded man's revolver cracked, and the looking-glass at the back of the parlour starred and came smashing and tinkling down. As the barman entered the room, he saw Marvel curiously crumpled up and struggling against the door that led to the yard and kitchen. The door flew open while the barman hesitated, and Marvel was dragged into the kitchen. There was a scream and a clatter of pans. Marvel head down, and lugging back obstinately, was forced to the kitchen door, and the bolts were drawn. Then the policeman who had been trying to pass the barman rushed in, followed by one of the cabmen, gripped the wrist of the invisible hand that collared Marvel, was hit in the face and went reeling back. The door opened, and Marvel made a frantic effort to obtain a lodgment behind it. Then the cabman collared something. I got him, said the cabman. The barman's red hands came clawing at the unseen. Here he is, said the barman. Mr. Marvel, released, suddenly dropped to the ground and made an attempt to crawl by the legs of a fighting man. The struggle blundered around the edge of the door. The voice of the invisible man was heard for the first time, yelling out sharply as the policeman trod on his foot. Then he cried out passionately, and his fists flew around like flails. The cabman suddenly whooped the door up, kicked under the diaphragm. The door into the bar parlour from the kitchen slammed and covered Mr. Marvel's retreat. The men in the kitchen found themselves clutching at and struggling with empty air. Where's he gone? Cried the man with the beard. Out. This way, said the policeman, stepping into the yard and stopping. A piece of tile whizzed by his head and smashed among the crockery on the kitchen table. I'll show him, shouted the man with the black beard, and suddenly a steel barrel shone over the policeman's shoulder, and 5 bullets had followed one another into the twilight whence the missile had come. As he fired, the man with the beard moved his hand in a horizontal curve, so that the shots radiated out into the narrow yard like spokes from a wheel. A silence followed. 5 cartridges, said the man with the black beard. That's the best of all. 4 aces and a joker. Get a lantern, someone, and come and feel about for his body. Also, that poor policeman. If this man fired a revolver, and when they just said a steel barrel shone over the policeman's shoulder, his hearing ain't in the best of spots, I don't think. That poor policeman is probably gone deaf, or at least for an hour or two. Anyhow, chapter 17. Dr. Kemp had continued riding in his study until the shots aroused him. Crack, crack, crack they came one after the other. "Hello," said Dr. Kemp, putting his pen into his mouth again and listening. "Who's a letting off revolvers in Burdock? What are the asses at now?" He went to the south window, threw it up, and leaning out stared down the network of windows, beaded gas lamps, and shops, with its black interstices of roof and yard that made up the town at night. "Looks like a crowd down the hill," he said, "by the cricketers," and remained watching. Then his eyes wandered over the town too far away, where a ship's light shone and the pier glowed. A little illuminated, faceted pavilion like a gem of yellow light. The moon in its first quarter hung over the westward hill, and the stars were clear and almost tropically bright. After 5 minutes, during which his mind had travelled into a remote speculation of social conditions of the future, and lost itself at last over the time dimension, Dr. Kemp roused himself with a sigh, pulled down the window again, and returned to his writing desk. It must have been about an hour after this that the front door bell rang. He had been writing slackly, and with intervals of abstraction. Since the shots he sat listening. He heard the servant answer the door, and waited for her feet on the staircase, but she did not come. "Wonder what that was," said Dr. Kemp. He tried to resume his work, filled, got up, went downstairs from his study to the landing, rang and called over the balustrade to the housemaid as she appeared in the hall below. "Was that a letter?" he asked. "Only a runaway ring, sir," she answered. "I'm restless tonight," he said to himself. He went back to his study and this time attacked his work resolutely. In a little while he was hard at work again, and the only sounds in the room were the ticking of a clock and the subdued shrillness of a squirrel, hurrying in the very centre of the circle of his light, his lampshade threw on his table. 'Twas 2 o'clock before Dr. Kemp had finished his work for the night. He rose, yawned, and went downstairs to bed. He had already removed his coat and vest. When he noticed that he was thirsty, he took a candle and went down to the dining room in search of a siphon and whiskey. Dr. Kemp's scientific pursuits have made him a very observant man, and as he recrossed the hall he noticed a dark spot on the linoleum near the mat at the foot of the stairs. He went on upstairs, and then it suddenly occurred to him to ask himself what a spot on the linoleum might be. Apparently some subconscious element was at work, At any rate, he turned with his burden, went back to the hall, put down the cider and whiskey, and bending down touched the spot. Without any great surprise, he found it had a stickiness and colour of drying blood. He took up his burden again and returned upstairs, looking about him and trying to account for the blood spot. On the landing page he saw something and stopped astonished. The door handle of his own room was blood-stained. He looked at his own hand, it was quite clean, and then he remembered that the door of his room had been open when he came down from his study, and that consequently he had not touched the handle at all. He went straight into his room, his face quite calm, perhaps a trifle more resolute than usual. His glance, wandering inquisitively, fell on the bed. On the counterpane was a mess of blood, and a sheet had been torn. He had not noticed this before, because he had walked straight to the dressing table. On the further side, the bedclothes were depressed as if someone had been recently sitting there. Then he had an odd impression that he had heard a low voice say, "Good heavens, Kemp." But Dr. Kemp was no believer in voices. He stood staring at the tumbled sheets. Was that really a voice? He looked about again, but noticed nothing further than a disordered and blood-stained bed. Then he distinctly heard a movement across the room, near the wash-hand stand. All men, however, my highly educated, retain some superstitious inklings. The feeling that is called eerie came upon him. He closed the door of the room, came forward to the dressing table, and put down his bandage of linen rag hanging in mid-air between him and the wash-hand stand. He stared at this in amazement. It was an empty bandage, a bandage properly tied but quite empty. He would have advanced to grasp it, but a touch arrested him, and a voice speaking quite close to him. "Kemp," said the voice. "Eh," said Kemp with his mouth open. "Keep your nerve," said the voice. "I'm an invisible man." Kemp made no answer for a space, simply stared at the bandage. "Invisible man," he said. "I am an invisible man," repeated the voice. The story had been active to ridicule. Only that morning rushed through Kemp's brain. He does not appear to have been either very much frightened or very greatly surprised at the moment. Realization came later. And hello there, Fitz and Frost. Thank you for the follow. Hope you're well. "I thought it was all a lie," he said. The thought uppermost in his mind was the reiterated arguments of the morning. "Have you a bandage on?" he asked. "Yes," said the invisible man. "Oh," said Kemp, and then roused himself. "I say," he said, "but is it nonsense? It's some trick." He stepped forward suddenly, and his hand extended towards the bandage, met invisible fingers. He recoiled at the touch, and his colour changed. "Keep steady, Kemp, for God's sake. I want help badly. Stop." The hand gripped his arm. He struck at it. "And thank you, Fitz and Frost. Thank you very much. I'm glad you're enjoying it, and it's hopefully helping you relax." tried to voice, "Kemp, keep steady," and the grip tightened around, a hand around Kemp's arm. A frantic desire to free himself took possession of Kemp. The hand of the bandaged arm gripped his shoulder, and he was suddenly tripped and flung backwards upon the bed. He opened his mouth to shout, and the corner of the sheet was thrust between his teeth. The invisible man had him down grimly, but his arms were free, and he struck and tried to kick savagely. "Listen to reason, will ya?" said the invisible man, sticking to him in spite of a pounding in the ribs. "By heaven, you'll madden me in a minute." And that's interesting. I think that right there is the first time in this book, maybe. It may be the first time in this book that the invisible man was actually referred to as the invisible man, instead of just the voice or something like. "Lie still, ya fool. Lie still, ya fool," bawled the invisible man in Kemp's ear. Kemp struggled for another moment, and then lay still. "If you shout, I'll smash your face," said the invisible man, relieving his mouth. "I'm an invisible man. It's no foolishness and no magic. I really am an invisible man, and I want your help. I don't want to hurt you, but if you behave like a frantic rustic, then I must. Don't you remember me, Kemp, Griffin of University College?" "Let me get up," said Kemp. "I'll stop where I am and let me sit quiet for a minute." He sat up and felt his neck. "I am Griffin of University College, and I have made myself invisible. I am just an ordinary man, a man you have known, made invisible." "Griffin," said Kemp. "Griffin," answered the voice. "A younger student than you were, almost an albino, 6 feet high and broad, with a pink and white face and red eyes, who won the medal for chemistry." "I am confused," said Kemp. "My brain is rioting. What has this to do with Griffin?" "I am Griffin." Kemp thought. "It's horrible," he said, "but what devilry must happen to make a man invisible?" "'Tis no devilry. 'Tis a process of sane and intelligible enough." "It's horrible," said Kemp. "How on earth?" "It's horrible enough, but I'm wounded and in pain and tired. Great God, Kemp, you are a man. Take it steady, give me some food and drink, and let me sit down here." Kemp stared at the bandages moved across the room, then saw a basket chair dragged across the floor and come to rest near the bed. It creaked and the seat was depressed, the quarter of an inch or so. He rubbed his eyes and felt his neck again. "Well, this beats ghosts," he said, and laughed stupidly. "That's better, thank heaven, you're getting sensible." "Or silly," said Kemp, and knuckled his eyes. "Give me some whiskey, I'm near death." "I didn't feel so. Where are you? If I get up, shall I run into you? There, all right, whiskey. Here, where shall I give it to you?" The chair creaked and Kemp felt the glass drawn away from him. He let go by an effort. His instinct was all against it. It came to rest poised 20 inches above the front edge of the seat of the chair. He stared at it in infinite perplexity. This must be hypnotism. You have suggested you are invisible." "Nonsense," said the voice. "It's frantic. Listen to me. I demonstrated conclusively this morning, began Kemp, that invisibility. Never mind what you've demonstrated. I'm starving, said the voice. And the night is chilly to a man without clothes. Hello there, Pompari, and you. Hope you're well. Food, asked Kemp. The tumbler of whiskey told itself. Yes, said the invisible man, wrapping it down. Have you a dressing gown? Kemp made him some exclamation in an undertone. He walked to a wardrobe and produced a robe of dingy scarlet. This do, he asked. 'Twas taken from him. It hung limp for a moment in mid-air, fluttered weirdly, stood full and decorous, buttoning itself, and sat down in his chair. Draw socks, slippers will be a comfort, said the unseen curtly, and food. Anything, but this is the insanest thing I ever was in my life. He turned out his drawers for the articles, and then went downstairs to ransack his larder. He came back with some cold cutlets and bread, poured up a light table, and placed them before his guest. Never mind knives, said his visitor, and a cutlet hung in mid-air with a sound of gnawing. Invisible, said Kemp, and sat down on a bedroom chair. I always like to get something about me before I eat, said the invisible man with a full mouth, eating greedily. Queer fancy. I suppose that wrist is all right, said Kemp. Trust me, said the invisible man. Of all the strange and wonderful. Of all the strange and wonderful. Exactly, but it's odd I should blunder into your house to get my bandaging. My first stroke of luck. Anyhow, I meant to sleep in this house tonight. You must stand that. It's a filthy nuisance, my blood showing, isn't it? Quite a clot over there. It's visible as it coagulates, I see. It's only the living tissue I've changed, and only for as long as I'm alive. I've been in the house 3 hours. But how's it done? Began Kemp in a tone of exasperation. Confound it, the whole business. It's unreasonable from beginning to end. No, quite reasonable. Said the invisible man, perfectly reasonable at that. He reached over and secured the whiskey bottle. Kemp stared at the devouring dressing gown, a ray of candlelight penetrating a torn patch in the right shoulder, made a triangle of light under the left ribs. What were the shots? He asked. How did the shooting begin? There was a real fool of a man, a sort of confederate of mine, Curzon, who tried to steal my money, has done so. Is he invisible too? No. Well, can't I have more to eat before I tell you all that? I'm hungry and pain, and you want me to tell stories. Kemp got up. You didn't do any shooting, he asked. Not me, said his visitor. Some fool I'd never seen fired at random. A lot of them got scared. They all got scared at me, Curzon. I say, I want more to eat in this camp. I'll see what there is to eat downstairs, said Kemp. Not much, I'm afraid. After he had done eating, and he made a heavy meal, the invisible man demanded a cigar. He bit the end savagely before Kemp could find a knife, and cursed when the outer leaf loosened. 'Twas strange to see him smoking, his mouth and throat, parings and nares, became visible as a sort of whirling smoke cloud. The blessed gift of smoking, he sat and puffed vigorously. I'm lucky to have fallen upon you, Camp. You must help me, fancy tumbling on you just now. I'm in a devilish scrape. I've been mad, I think, the things I have been through. But we will do things yet, let me tell you. He helped himself to more whiskey and soda. Camp got up, looked about him, and fetched a glass from his spare room. It's wild, but I suppose I may drink. You haven't changed much, Camp. These dozen years, you fair men don't. Cool and methodical, after the first collapse, I must tell you we will work together. But how was it all done, said Camp, and how did you get like this? For God's sake, let me smoke in peace for a little while, and then I will begin to tell you. But the story was not told that night. The invisible man's wrist was growing painful. He was feverish, exhausted, and his mind came round to brood upon his chase down the hill, and the struggle about the inn. He spoke in fragments of marvel. He smoked fast and his voice grew angry. Camp tried to gather what he could. He was afraid of me, I could see that he was afraid of me, said the invisible man many times over. He meant to give me the slip, he was always casting about. What a fool I was. The cur, I should have killed him. Where did you get the money? Asked Camp abruptly. The invisible man was silent for a space. I can't tell you tonight, he said. He groaned suddenly and leaned forward, supporting his invisible head on the visible hands. Camp, he said, I've had no sleep for near 3 days, except a couple of dozens of an hour or so. I must sleep soon. Well, have my room, have this room. But how can I sleep? If I sleep he will get away. Ugh, what does it matter? What's the shot wound? Asked Camp abruptly. Nothing, scratch and blood. Oh God, how I want sleep. Why not? The invisible man appeared to be regarding Camp. Because of particular objection to being caught by my fellow men, he said slowly. Camp started. Fool that I am, said the invisible man, striking the table smartly. I've put the idea into your head. And that's a good idea, Bisk. To be honest, you may have a tab open with Chubby soon enough anyways. Let me see. 1, maybe 2 more chapters depending on their length. Chapter 18. The invisible man sleeps. Exhausted and wounded as the invisible man was, he refused to accept Camp's word that his freedom should be respected. He examined the 2 windows of the bedroom, drew up the blinds and opened the sashes to confirm Camp's statement that a retreat by them would be possible. Outside the night was very quiet and still, and the new moon was setting over a down. Then he examined the keys of the bedroom and the 2 dressing room doors, to satisfy himself that these also could be made an assurance of freedom. Finally he expressed himself satisfied. He stood on the hard rock and Camp heard the sound of a yawn. I'm sorry, said the invisible man. If I cannot tell you all that I have done tonight, but I am worn out. It's grotesque, no doubt. It's horrible, but believe me, Kemp, in spite of your arguments this morning, it is quite a possible thing. I have made a discovery. I meant to keep it to myself. I can't. I must have a partner, and you. We can do such things, but tomorrow. Now, Kemp, I feel as though I must sleep or perish. Kemp stood in the middle of the room, staring at the endless garment. I suppose I must leave you, he said. This incredible 3 things happening like this, overturning all my preconceptions, would make me insane, but it's real. Is there anything more that I can get you? Only bid me good night, said Griffin. Good night, said Kemp, and shook an invisible hand. He walked sideways to the door. Suddenly the dressing gown walked quickly towards him. Understand me, said the dressing gown. No attempts to hamper me or capture me or... Kemp's face changed a little. I thought I gave you my word, he said. Kemp closed the door softly behind him, and the key was turned upon him forthwith. Then, as he stood with an expression of passive amazement on his face, the rapid feet came to the door of the dressing room, and that too was locked. Kemp slapped his brow with his hands. Am I dreaming? Has the world gone mad? Or have I? He laughed and put his hand to the locked door. Barred out of my own bedroom by a flagrant absurdity, he said. He walked to the head of the staircase, turned and stared at the locked doors. "'Tis fact," he said. He put his fingers in his slightly bruised neck. "Undeniable fact. But..." He shook his head hopelessly, turned and went downstairs. He lit the dining room lamp, got out a cigar, and began pacing the room, ejaculating. Now and then he would argue with himself. "Invisible," he said. Is there such a thing as an invisible animal? In the sea, yes, thousands, millions, all the larvae, all the little naupli and the tornaria, all the microscopic things, the jellyfish. In the sea there are more things invisible than visible. I never thought of that before. And in the ponds too, all those little pond-like things, specks of colourless translucent jelly. But in air, no. And hello, unnamed, thank you for the follow. Hope you're doing well. It can't be, but after all, why not? If a man was made of glass, he would still be visible. His meditation became profound. The bulk of 3 cigars had passed into the invisible or diffused as a white ash over the carpet before he spoke again. Then it was merely an exclamation. He turned aside, walked out of the room, and went into his little consulting room, and lit the gas there. It was a little room because Dr. Kemp did not live by practice, and in it were the day's newspapers. The morning's paper lay carelessly opened and thrown aside. He caught it up, turned it over, and read the account of a strange story from Iping, that the mariner at Port Stowe had spelled over so painfully to Mr. Marvel. Kemp read it swiftly. "Wrapped up," said Kemp, "disguised, hiding it. No one seems to have been aware of his misfortune. What the devil is his game?" He dropped the paper and his eye went seeking. "Ah," he said, and caught up the St. James's Gazette, flying forward up as they ripe. "Now we shall get at the truth," said Dr. Kemp. He rent the paper open, a couple of columns confronted him. "An entire village in Sussex goes mad," was the heading. And thank you, honey. Thank you very much. Glad you're enjoying it. "Good heavens," said Kemp, reading eagerly an incredulous account of the events in Iping of the previous afternoon that have already been described. Over the leaf of the report in the morning paper had been reprinted. He reread it, ran through the streets, striking right and left, Jeffers insensible, Mr. Huxter in great pain, still unable to describe what he saw. Painful humiliation figure. Woman ill with terror. Windows smashed. This extraordinary story probably a fabrication. Too good not to print, cum grano. He dropped the paper and stared blankly in front of him. Probably a fabrication. He caught up the paper again and reread the whole business. But whence the tramp come in? Why the deuce was he chasing a tramp? "I'm from the Netherlands," I named. But I don't know, my accent is a mystery so far. Don't really know what my accent's all about. He sat down abruptly on the surgical bench. "He's not only invisible," he said, "but he's mad, homicidal." When dawn came to mingle its pallor with the lamplight and cigar smoke at a dining room, Kemp was still pacing up and down, trying to grasp the incredible. He was altogether too excited to sleep. His servants, descending sleepily, discovered him and were inclined to think that overstudy had worked this ill on him. He gave them extraordinary but quite explicit instructions to lay breakfast for two in the Belvedere study, and then to confine themselves to the basement and ground floor. Then he continued to pace the dining room until the morning's paper came. That had much to say and little to tell. Beyond the confirmation of the evening before, and a very badly written account of another remarkable tale from Port Burdock. This gave Kemp the essence of the happenings at the Jolly Cricketers, and the name of Marvel. "He has made me keep within 24 hours, Marvel testified. Certain minor facts were added to the Iping story, notably the cutting of the village telegraph wire. But there was nothing to throw light on the connection between the invisible man and the tramp, for Mr. Marvel had supplied no information about the 3 books or the money with which he was lined. The incredulous tone had vanished, and a show of reporters and inquirers were already at work elaborating the matter. Bit of a Irish twang, yeah. Got it a lot. Bit of a Irish or Scottish bias, but it is not quite Irish or Scottish either. I mean, in this book it might veer more towards British, but that's because some of the things in this book are written in a very British way. At least some of the speeches are written as if you'd were to pronounce it in a bit more profound British accent. Kemp read every scrap of the report and sent his housemaid out to get every one of the morning papers she could. These also he devoured. He's invisible, he said, and it reads like rage grown to mania. The things he may do, the things he may do. And he's upstairs free as the air. What on earth ought I to do? For instance, was it a breach of faith if... No. He went to a little untidy desk in the corner and began a note. He tore this up half-written and wrote another. He read it over and considered it. Then he took an envelope and addressed it to Colonel Anjay, Port Burdock. The invisible man awoke even as Kemp was doing this. He awoke in an evil temper, and Kemp, alert for every sound, heard his pattering feet rush suddenly across the bedroom overhead. Then a chair was flung over, and the wash-hand stand tumbler was smashed. Kemp hurried upstairs and rapped eagerly. Let me just quickly scout out how long the next chapter is. Alright. And hello, Alan Walker, how do you do? Hope you're well. Thank you for the follow. Quick water break, actually. And then we jump straight into chapter 19, Certain First Principles. What's the matter? Asked Kemp when the invisible man admitted him. Nothing, was the answer, but confound it, the smash. Fit of temper, said the invisible man, forgot his arm and it's sore. You're rather liable to that sort of thing. I am. Kemp walked across the room and picked up the fragments of broken glass. What effects are about you, said Kemp, standing up with the glass in his hand. What had happened in Iping and down the hill, the world had become aware of its invisible citizen, but no one knows you are here. The invisible man swore. The secret's out. I gather it was a secret. I don't know what your plans are, but of course I'm anxious to help you. The invisible man sat down on the bed. There's breakfast upstairs, said Kemp, speaking as slowly as possible, and he was delighted to find his strange guest rose most willingly. Kemp led the way up the narrow staircase to the belvedere. Before we can do anything else, said Kemp, I must understand a little more about this invisibility of yours. He had sat down after one nervous glance out of the window, with the air of a man who was talking to do. His doubt of the sanity of the entire business flashed and vanished again as he looked across to where Griffin sat at the breakfast table, a handless dressing gown wiping unseen lips on a miraculously held serviette. "'Tis simple enough and credible enough," said Griffin, putting the serviette aside and leaning the invisible hat on an invisible hand. "No doubt to you, but..." Kemp laughed. "Well, yes, to me it seemed wonderful at first, no doubt, but now, great God. But we will do great things yet. I came on the stuff first at Chesilstowe. I went there after I left London. You know, I dropped medicine and took up physics. No, well, I did. Light fascinated me. Ah. Optical density. The whole subject is a network of riddles, a network with solutions, glimmering elusively through, and being put 22 and full of enthusiasm. I said I will devote my life to this. This is worthwhile. You know what fools we are at 2 and 20. Fools then or fools now, said Kemp, as though knowing could be any satisfaction to a man. But I went to work, and I had hardly worked and thought about the matter 6 months before light came through one of the meshes suddenly, blindingly. I found a general principle of pigments and refraction, a formula, a geometrical expression involving 4 dimensions. Fools, common man, even common mathematicians do not know anything of what some general expression may mean to the student of molecular physics. In the books that Tramp has hidden, there are marvels, miracles, but this was not a method, it was an idea that might lead to a method by which it would be possible, without changing any other property of matter, except in some instances colours, to lower the refractive index of a substance, solid or liquid, to that of air. So far as all practical purposes are concerned. Phew, said Kemp, that's odd, but still I don't see quite. I can understand that thereby you could spoil the valuable stone, but personal invisibility is a far cry. Precisely, said Griffin, but consider, visibility depends on the action of the visible bodies on light. Either a body absorbs light, or it reflects or refracts it, or does all these things. If it neither reflects nor refracts nor absorbs light, it cannot of itself be visible. You see an opaque red box, for instance, because the color absorbs some of the light and reflects the rest, or the red part of the light to you. If it did not absorb any particular part of the light, but reflected it all, then it would be a shining white box, silver. A diamond box would neither absorb much of the light, nor reflect much from a general surface, but just here and there, where the surfaces were favourable, the light would be refracted and reflected and refracted, so that you would get a brilliant appearance of flashing reflections and translucencies, a sort of skeleton of light. A glass box would not be so brilliant nor so clearly visible as a diamond box, because there would be less refraction and reflection. See that, from certain points of view, you would see quite clearly through it. Some kinds of glass would be more visible than others. A box of thin glass would be brighter than a box of ordinary window glass. A box of very thin common glass would be hard to see in a bad light, because it would absorb hardly any light and refract and reflect very little. And if you put a sheet of common white glass in water, and still more if you put it in some denser liquid than water, it would vanish almost together, because light passing from water to glass is only slightly refracted or reflected or indeed affected in any way. It is almost as invisible as a jet of coal gas or hydrogen is in air, and for precisely the same reason. Yes, said Kemp, that is pretty plain sailing. And here is another fact you will know to be true. If a sheet of glass is smashed hemp and beaten into a powder, it becomes much more visible while it is in the air. It becomes at last an opaque white powder. This is because the powdering multiplies the surface of the glass, at which refraction and reflection occur. In a sheet of glass there are only two surfaces. In the powder the light is reflected or refracted by each grain it passes through, and very little gets right through the powder. But if the white powdered glass is put into water, it forthwith vanishes. The powdered glass and water have much the same refractive index, that is, the light undergoes very little refraction or reflection in passing from one to another. Yes indeed, said Kemp. But a man's not powdered glass. No, said Griffin. He's more transparent. Nonsense. Autumn. Alright, sorry about that. No, nonsense, Griffith. How's a man more transparent than powdered glass? That from a doctor, how one forgets. Have you already forgotten your physics in 10 years? Just think of all the things that are transparent and seem not to be so. Paper, for instance, is made up of transparent fibers, and it is wire and opaque, only for the same reason that a powder of glass is wire and opaque. Oil white paper, fill up the interstices between the particles with oil, so that there is no longer diffraction or reflection, except at the surfaces, and it becomes as transparent as glass, and not only paper, but cotton fiber, linen fiber, wool fiber, woody fiber and bone, Kemp, flesh, Kemp, hair, Kemp, nails and nerves, Kemp. In fact, the whole fabric of a man, except the red of his blood and the black pigment of hair, are all made up of transparent, colourless tissue. So little suffices to make us visible one to the other. For the most part, the fibers of living creatures are no more opaque than water. Great heavens, cried Kemp. Of course, of course. I was thinking only last night of the sea larva and old jellyfish. And now you have me, and all that I knew and had in mind a year after I left London 6 years ago, but I kept it to myself. I had to do my work under frightful disadvantages. Oliver, my professor, was a scientific bounder, a journalist by instinct, a thief of ideas. He was always prying, and you know, the knavish system of the scientific world. I simply would not publish, and let him share my credit. I went on working. I got nearer and nearer making my formula into an experiment, a reality. I told no living soul because I meant to flash my word upon the world with crushing effect, and became famous at a blow. I took up the question of pigments to fill up certain gaps, and suddenly, not by design but by accident, I made a discovery in physiology. Ah yes, she added. You know the red colouring matter of blood. It can be made white, colourless, and remain with all the functions it has now. Kemp gave a cry of incredulous amazement. The invisible man arose and began pacing the little study. You may well exclaim, I remember that night. It was late at night. In the daytime one was bothered with the gaping, silly students, and I worked then sometimes till dawn. It came suddenly splendid and complete in my mind. I was alone. The laboratory was still, with the tall lights burning brightly and silently. In all my great moments, I've been alone. One could make an animal with tissue transparent. One could make it invisible. All except the pigment. I could be invisible, I said, suddenly realizing what it meant to be an albino with such knowledge. It was overwhelming. I left the filtering I was doing and went and stared out of the great window at the stars. I could be invisible, I repeated. To do such a thing would be to transcend magic, and I beheld, unclouded by doubt, a magnificent vision of all that invisibility might mean to a man, the mystery, the power, the freedom, drawbacks I saw none. You've only to think, and I, a shabby, poverty-struck hemmed in demonstrator, teaching fools in a provincial college, might suddenly become this. I asked you, Kemp, if you, anyone, I tell you, would have flung himself upon that research, and I worked 3 years at every mountain of difficulty. I toiled, overshowed another from its summit. The infinite details and the exasperation. A professor, a provincial professor, always prying, when are you going to publish this work of yours, was his everlasting question. And the students, the cramped means, 3 years I had of it. And after 3 years of secrecy and exasperation, I found that to complete it was impossible. How? Asked Kemp. Money, said the invisible man, and went again to stare out of the window. He turned around abruptly. I robbed the old man, robbed my father. The money was not his, and he shot himself. And hello, Comedio Vladimir, hope you're well, thank you for the follow. And alright, the next chapter looks to me pretty big. Okay, that's actually, yeah, that's quite a chapter. So I'll start signing off, right? It's going well, Crawford, it's going well. Glad I got another 2 hours in the day. Getting along quite well with the book, and it is a great book. I don't know how much of it you've managed to catch, but The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells has been a lovely book so far. Toronto, we just read chapter 19, so there's 9 or 10 chapters to go, I think, so out of my head. So a nice amount left for tomorrow, I think. I'll have to see. Maybe we'll have time left over tomorrow, depending. And thank you for keeping me hydrated, Vladimir. And no worries, Unicorn. Always love that. I don't know. I always love helping people, and it's always nice to hear, like, it's relaxing or something like that. It's always good to hear those kind of things. So I'm glad you enjoyed it. Hope your chores are going well. And let me start a raid on over to the lovely Mr. Chewy. Haven't caught much of him in a while. So thank you all for having been here, and I'm pretty sure I'll be able to finish The Invisible Man sometime tomorrow. Sometime tomorrow will be Pixel Vegas, but yeah, don't really have much of a schedule. It'll probably be pretty late in the day for me, because there's some other things as well tomorrow. So I'll have to see, to be fair. I think maybe I can quickly check up on the time. What would maybe 2 PM UTC or so tomorrow. An hour earlier or an hour. Actually, let's go maybe with 1 PM UTC tomorrow. Probably. An hour earlier or an hour later, maybe. But expect to see me around that time. We'll see, we'll see. Thank you all for having been here, and I hope you all enjoy the lovely Mr. Chewy, his ASMR as well. See you all there. Take care.